As special counsel for the Pujo Committee, Untermeyer ran the hearings as a one-man operation. The congressional members, including its chairman, Congressman Arsene Pujo, seemed to have been struck dumb from the commencement of the hearings to their conclusion. One of these silent servants of the public was Congressman James Byrnes of South Carolina, representing Bernard Baruch's home district, who later achieved fame as Baruch's man and was placed by Baruch in charge of the Office of War Mobilization during the Second World War. Although he was a specialist in such matters, Untermeyer did not ask any of the bankers about the system of interlocking directories through which they controlled industry. He did not go into international gold movements, which were known as a factor in money panics, or the international relationships between American bankers and European bankers. The international banking houses of Eugene Meyer, Lazard Freres, J&W Seligman, Ladenburg, Thalmann, Speyer Brothers, M.M. Warburg, and the Rothschild brothers did not arouse Samuel Untermeyer's curiosity, although it was well known in the New York financial world that all of these family banking houses either had branches or controlled subsidiary houses in Wall Street. When Jacob Schiff appeared before the Pujo Committee, Mr. Untermeyer's adroit questioning allowed Mr. Schiff to talk for many minutes without revealing any information about the operations of the banking house of Kuhn Loeb Company, of which he was senior partner, and which Senator Robert L. Owen had identified as the representative of the European Rothschilds in the United States. The aging J.P. Morgan, who had only a few more months to live, appeared before the committee to justify his decades of international financial deals. He stated, for Mr. Untermeyer's edification, that money is a commodity. This was a favorite ploy of the money creators, as they wished to make the public believe that the creation of money was a natural occurrence, akin to the growing of a field of corn, although it was actually a bounty conferred upon the bankers by governments over which they had gained control. J.P. Morgan also told the Pujo Committee that, in making a loan, he seriously considered only one factor, a man's character. Even the man's ability to repay the loan or his collateral were of little importance. This astonishing observation startled even the blasé members of the committee. The farce of the Pujo Committee ended without a single well-known opponent of the money creators being allowed to appear or testify. As far as Samuel Untermeyer was concerned, Senator La Follette and Congressman Charles Augustus Lindbergh had never existed. Nevertheless, these congressmen had managed to convince the people of the United States that the New York bankers did have a monopoly on the nation's money and credit. At the close of the hearings, the bankers and their subsidized newspapers claimed that the only way to break this monopoly was to enact the banking and currency legislation, now being proposed to Congress, a bill which would be passed a year later as the Federal Reserve Act. The press seriously demanded that the New York bank monopoly be broken by turning over the administration of the new banking system to the most knowledgeable banker of them all, Paul Warburg. The presidential campaign of 1912 records one of the more interesting political upsets in American history. The incumbent, William Howard Taft, was a popular president, and the Republicans, in a period of general prosperity, were firmly in control of the government through a Republican majority in both houses. The Democratic challenger, Woodrow Wilson, governor of New Jersey, had no national recognition and was a stiff, austere man who excited little public support. Both parties included the monetary reform bill in their platforms. The Republicans were committed to the Aldrich Plan, which had been denounced as a Wall Street plan, and the Democrats had the Federal Reserve Act. Neither party bothered to inform the public that the bills were almost identical, except for the names. In retrospect, it seems obvious that the money creators decided to dump Taft and go with Wilson. How do we know this? Taft seemed certain of re-election, and Wilson would return to obscurity. Suddenly, Theodore Roosevelt threw his hat into the ring. He announced that he was running as a third-party candidate, the Bull Moose. His candidacy would have been ludicrous had it not been for the fact that he was exceptionally well financed. Moreover, he was given unlimited press coverage, more than Taft and Wilson combined. Does it sound familiar? Does that sound familiar? Bloomberg? What? As a Republican ex-president, it was obvious that Roosevelt would cut deeply into Taft's vote. This proved the case, and Wilson won the election. To this day, no one can say what Theodore Roosevelt's program was, or why he would sabotage his own party. Since the bankers were financing all three candidates, they would win regardless of the outcome. Later, congressional testimony showed that in the firm of Kuhn Loeb Company, Felix Warburg was supporting Taft, Paul Warburg and Jacob Schiff were supporting Wilson, and Otto Kahn was supporting Roosevelt. The result was that a Democratic Congress and a Democratic President were elected in 1912 to get the central bank legislation passed. It seems probable that the identification of the Aldrich Plan was a Wall Street operation, predicted that it would have a difficult passage through Congress as the Democrats would solidly oppose it, whereas a successful Democratic candidate, supported by a Democratic Congress, would be able to pass the central bank plan. Taft was thrown overboard because the bankers doubted he could deliver on the Aldrich Plan, and Roosevelt was the instrument of his demise. The final electoral vote in 1912 was Wilson 409, Roosevelt 167, and Taft 15. To further confuse the American people and blind them to the real purpose of the proposed Federal Reserve Act, the architects of the Aldrich Plan, powerful Nelson Aldrich, although no longer a senator, and Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank, set up a hue and cry against the bill. They gave interviews whenever they could find an audience denouncing the proposed Federal Reserve Act as inimical to banking and to good government. The boogaboo of inflation was raised because of the Act's provisions for printing Federal Reserve notes. The Nation on October 23, 1913, pointed out, Mr. Aldrich himself raised a hue and cry over the issue of government. Fiat money, that is, money issued without gold or bullion back of it, although a bill to do precisely that had been passed in 1908 with his own name as author, and he knew, besides, that the government had nothing to do with it, and that the Federal Reserve Board would have full charge of the issuing of such monies. Frank Vanderlip's claims were so bizarre that Senator Robert L. Owen, chairman of the newly formed Senate Banking and Currency Committee, which had been formed on March 18, 1913, accused him of openly carrying on a campaign of misrepresentation about the bill. The interests of the public, so Carter Glass claimed in a speech on September 10, 1913 to Congress, would be protected by an advisory council of bankers. There can be nothing sinister about its transactions. Meeting with it at least 4 times a year will be a bankers' advisory council representing every regional reserve district in the system. How could we have exercised greater caution in safeguarding the public interests? Glass claimed that the proposed Federal Advisory Council would force the Federal Reserve Board of Governors to act in the best interest of the people. Senator Root raised the problem of inflation, claiming that under the Federal Reserve Act, note circulation would always expand indefinitely, causing great inflation. However, the later history of the Federal Reserve System showed that it not only caused inflation, but that the issue of notes could also be restricted, causing deflation, as occurred from 1929 to 1939. One of the critics of the proposed decentralized system was a lawyer from Cleveland, Ohio, Alfred Crozier. Crozier was called to testify for the Senate committee because he had written a provocative book in 1912, U.S. Money versus Corporation Currency. He attacked the Aldrich-Vreeland Act of 1908 as a Wall Street instrument, and he pointed out that when our government had to issue money based on privately owned securities, we were no longer a free nation. Crozier testified before the committee that it should prohibit the granting or calling in of loans for the purpose of influencing quotation prices of securities and the contracting of loans or increasing interest rates in concert by the banks to influence public opinion or the action of any legislative body. Within recent months, William McAdoo, Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, was reported in the open press as charging specifically that there was a conspiracy among certain of the large banking interests to put a contraction upon the currency and to raise interest rates for the sake of making the public force Congress into passing currency legislation desired by those interests. The so-called administration currency bill grants just what Wall Street and the big banks for 25 years have been striving for, that is, private instead of public control of currency. It does this as completely as the Aldrich Plan, as the Aldrich Bill. Both measures rob the government and the people of all effective control over the public's money, and vest in the banks exclusively the dangerous power to make money among the people Invest in the banks exclusively the dangerous power to make money among the people, scarce or plenty. The Aldrich Bill puts this power in one central bank. The administration bill puts it in 12 regional central banks, all owned exclusively by the identical private interests that would have owned and operated the Aldrich Bank. President Garfield, shortly before his assassination, declared that whoever controls the supply of currency would control the business and activities of the people. Thomas Jefferson warned us 100 years ago that a private central bank issuing the public currency was a greater menace to the liberties of the people than a standing army. It is interesting to note how many assassinations of presidents of the United States follow their concern with the issuing of public currency. Lincoln with his greenback, non-interest bearing notes, and Garfield making a pronouncement on currency problems just before he was assassinated. JFK. We now begin to understand why such a lengthy campaign of planned deception was necessary, from the secret conference at Jekyll Island to the identical reform plans proposed by the Democratic and Republican parties under different names. The bankers could not wrest control of the issuance of money from the citizens of the United States, to whom it had been designated through its Congress by the Constitution, until the Congress granted them their monopoly for a central bank. Therefore, much of the influence exerted to get the Federal Reserve Act passed was done behind the scenes, principally by two shadowy, non-elected persons, the German immigrant Paul Warburg and Colonel Edward Mendel House of Texas. Paul Warburg made an appearance before the House Banking and Currency Committee in 1913, in which he briefly stated his background. I am a member of the banking house of Kuhn Loeb Company. I came over to this country in 1902, having been born and educated in the banking businesses in Hamburg, Germany, and studied banking in London and Paris, and have gone all around the world. In the panic of 1907, the first suggestion I made was, let us get a national clearinghouse. The Aldrich Plan contains some things which are simply fundamental rules of banking. Your aim in this plan, the Owen Glass Bill, must be the same: centralizing of reserves, mobilizing commercial credit, and getting an elastic note issue. Warburg's phrase, mobilization of credit, was an important one because the First World War was due to begin shortly, and the first task of the Federal Reserve System would be to finance the war. The European nations were already bankrupt because they had maintained large standing armies for almost 50 years, a situation created by their own central banks, and therefore they could not finance a war. A central bank always imposes a tremendous burden on the nation for rearmament and defense in order to create inextinguishable debt, simultaneously creating a military dictatorship and enslaving the people to pay the interest on the debt which the bankers have artificially created. In the Senate debate on the Federal Reserve Act, Senator Stone said on December 12, 1913, "The great banks for years have sought to have and control agents in the Treasury to serve their purposes." Let me quote from this World article. Just as soon as Mr. McAdoo came to Washington, a woman whom the National City Bank had installed in the Treasury Department to get advanced information on the condition of banks and other matters of interest to the big Wall Street group, was removed. Immediately the Secretary and the Assistant Secretary, John Skelton Williams, were criticized severely by the agents of the Wall Street group. I myself have known more than one occasion when bankers refused credit to men who opposed their political views and purposes. When Senator Aldrich and others were going around the country exploiting this scheme, the big banks of New York and Chicago were engaged in raising a munificent fund to bolster up the Aldrich propaganda. I have been told by bankers of my own state that the contributions to this exploitation fund had been demanded of them, and that they had contributed because they were afraid of being blacklisted or boycotted. There are bankers of this country who are enemies of the public welfare. In the past, a few great banks have followed policies and projects that have paralyzed the industrial energies of the country to perpetuate their tremendous power over the financial and business industries of America. Carter Glass stated in his autobiography that he was summoned by Woodrow Wilson to the White House, and that Wilson told him he intended to make the reserve notes obligations of the United States. Glass says, "I was, for an instant, speechless. I remonstrated. There is not any government obligation here, Mr. President. Wilson said he had to compromise on this point in order to save the bill. The term compromise on this point came directly from Paul Warburg. Colonel Elisha Eli Garrison in Roosevelt, Wilson, and the Federal Reserve Law wrote, the term compromise on this point came directly from Paul Warburg. Colonel Elisha Eli Garrison in Roosevelt, Wilson, and the Federal Reserve Law wrote, in 1911, Lawrence Abbott, Mr. Roosevelt's private officer at the Outlook, handed me a copy of the so-called Aldrich Plan for currency reform. I said I could not believe that Mr. Warburg was the author. This plan is nothing more than the Aldrich-Vreeland legislation, which provided for currency issue against securities. Warburg knows that as well as I do. I'm not going to see him at once and ask him about it. I am going to see him at once and ask him about it. All right, the truth. Yes, I wrote it, he said. Why? I asked. It was a compromise, answered Warburg. In 1911, Lawrence Abbott, Mr. Roosevelt's private officer at the Outlook, handed me a copy of the so-called Aldrich Plan for currency reform. I said I could not believe that Mr. Warburg was the author. This plan is nothing more than the Aldrich-Vreeland legislation, which provided for currency issue against securities. Warburg knows that as well as I do. I am going to see him at once and ask him about it. All right? The truth. Yes, I wrote it, he said. Why? I asked. It was a compromise, answered Warburg. Garrison says that Warburg wrote him on February 8, 1912. I have no doubt that at the end of a thorough discussion, either you will see it my way or I will see it yours. But I hope you will see it mine. This was another famous Warburg saying when he secretly lobbied congressmen to support his interest, the veiled threat that they should see it his way. Those who did not found large sums contributed to their opponents at the next elections, and usually went down in defeat. Colonel Garrison, an agent of Brown Brothers bankers, later Brown Brothers Harriman, had entry everywhere in the financial community. He writes of Colonel House. Colonel House agreed entirely with the early writing of Mr. Warburg. Page 337, he quotes Colonel House. I'm also suggesting that the Central Board be increased from 4 members to 5, and their terms lengthened from 8 to 10 years. This would give stability and would take away the power of a president to change the personnel of the board during a single term of office. House's phrase, take away the power of a president, is significant because later presidents found themselves helpless to change the direction of the government because they did not have the power to change the composition of the Federal Reserve Board to attain a majority on it during that president's term of office. Garrison also wrote in this book, Paul Warburg is the man who got the Federal Reserve Act together after the Aldrich Plan aroused such nationwide resentment and opposition. The mastermind of both plans was Baron Alfred Rothschild of London. Colonel Edward Mandell House was referred to by Rabbi Stephen Weiss in his autobiography, Challenging Years, as the official Secretary of State. House noted that he and Wilson knew that in passing the Federal Reserve Act, they had created an instrument more powerful than the Supreme Court. The Federal Reserve Board of Governors actually comprised a Supreme Court of Finance, and there was no appeal from any of their rulings. In 1911, prior to Wilson's taking office as president, House had returned to his home in Texas and completed a book called Philip Drew, Administrator. Ostensibly a novel, it was actually a detailed plan for the future government of the United States, which would establish socialism as dreamed by Karl Marx, according to House. This novel predicted the enactment of the graduated income tax, excessive profits tax, unemployment insurance, social security, and a flexible currency system. In short, it was the blueprint which was later followed by the Woodrow Wilson and Franklin D. Roosevelt administrations. Out of the administration, it was published anonymously by B.W. Hughesbeck of New York, Hughes of New York, and widely circulated among government officials who were left in no doubt as to its authorship. George Sylvester Viereck, who knew House for years, later wrote an account of the Wilson-House relationship, the strangest friendship in history. In 1955, Westbrook Pegler D. the Hearst columnist from 1932 to 1956, heard of the Philip Drew book and called Weyrich to ask if he had a copy. Weyrich sent Pegler his copy of the book, and Pegler wrote a column about it, stating, "One of the institutions outlined in Philip Drew is the Federal Reserve System. The Schiffs, the Warburgs, the Kahns, the Rockefellers, and Morgans put their faith in House. The Schiff, Warburg, Rockefeller, and Morgan interests were personally represented in the mysterious conference at Jekyll Island. Frankfurter landed on the Harvard Law faculty thanks to a financial contribution to Harvard by Felix Warburg and Paul Warburg, and so we got Alger and Donald Hiss, Lee Pressman, Harry Dexter White, and many other protégés of Little Weenie." House's openly socialistic views were forthrightly expressed in Philip Drew, Administrator, on pages 57 to 58. House wrote, "In a direct and forceful manner, he pointed out that our civilization was fundamentally wrong, inasmuch, among other things, as it restricted efficiency, that if society were properly organized, there would be none who were not sufficiently clothed and fed. The result, that the laws, habits, and ethical training in vogue were alike responsible for the inequalities in opportunity and the consequent wide differences between the few and the many, that the results of such conditions was to render inefficient a large part of the population, the percentage differing in each country in the ratio that education and enlightenment and unselfish laws bore to ignorance, bigotry, and selfish laws."